Thanks, nice to be here. Very grateful for the invitation. So yeah, I'm here to actually present the project we've been working on with our partners from Central and Eastern Europe. My name is Michał Wendolowski, and I'm leading Bellona Europa's work in Central and Eastern Europe. And recently that's been mainly trying to build momentum for CCS deployment in that region. Maybe before I talk about the project, I would like to briefly introduce Bellona. So we are a climate NGO, and we are based in Brussels. And I think some of you might know us, and you know us for our long-standing support for CCS. And as one of our key focus areas of work is industrial decarbonization, we strongly believe that CCS is one of the key solutions for heavy industry in the transition to climate neutrality. And we are also the expert partner in the project I'm about to present. The full name of the project is Building Momentum for the Long-Term CCS Deployment in Central and Eastern Europe. We also refer to it as CCS for CEE. It's funded by the EEA and Norway grants as part of the climate change mitigation program. And the idea is to promote CCS, to build momentum for CCS deployment. And we've been doing that for the last 2 years together with our project partners from Poland, Latvia, Romania, and Czechia. And the project covers no less than 11 countries. And yeah, we've been engaging with the local stakeholders, writing analytical reports, assessing the CCS status in those countries, organizing national seminars and workshops, policy event in Brussels, and more recently we've also published a series of CCS deployment roadmaps with our recommendations for policymakers and industry actors. As I said, we just had, 2 weeks ago, we had a policy event in Brussels, which I think was quite successful with 100 people, 150 participants following the event. We invited some of the project developers from the region, companies like Heidelberg Cement, Air Liquide, who are actually breaking ground and with pioneering projects, CCS projects. In Central and Eastern Europe, we also had policymakers from European institutions and representatives of national authorities. And I kind of appreciate that CEE region may not be on many people's radar when it comes to CCS, but actually, I think Vít Kladík already also alluded to it, and some other speakers maybe. There are some quite interesting developments going on in the region. We see the momentum building. So I'd like to share some of the findings from our project to kind of provide you with some background for these developments. So I'll start with some high-level macroeconomic information about the region. So since the early 90s, with the political and economic transformation, the GDP of Central Eastern European countries have been increasing. If we look at the GDP per capita, they are still below the EU average, but they're catching up pretty rapidly and continuously. There has also been a shift to more service-based economy, or service-oriented economy. But interestingly, industrial sectors still play a very important role in CE economies. In relative terms, they're actually contributing more to the economy than in Western Europe. So on EU average, the contribution of industrial sectors is about 19%, and in some of the CE countries, we've seen this contribution to be higher than 35% to the national GDP. So it's heavy industry are an important sector. Production of cement, lime, glass, metals. So they are known for process emissions. So they're stubborn emissions, hard to abate, or considered hard to abate. So they could potentially be a fertile ground for CCS. But it's quite a diverse region, and if we look at the emission profile I selected 3 countries. We have Poland with the largest emitter in the region, with the majority of emissions associated with the production of energy and transport. So these are the different shades of red. And then we have a country like Slovakia, which is emits much less CO2. But the blue bits of the graph representing CO2 emissions associated with industrial processes. And in the case of Slovakia, they represent 20% of overall CO2 emissions, whereas in Poland it's just 5%. And then we have an extreme case of Estonia, where pretty much almost all emissions are associated with energy and transport, and industry represents less than 1% of CO2 emissions of the country. Also, if we look at the distribution of the largest emitters, the situation varies across countries. Big concentration of large emitters in Poland, and a bit more sparse in countries like Slovakia or Estonia. So together with our partners, we also looked at the storage potential, and of course I have to caution that these are indicative numbers, and this audience will know better than anyone else that assessing storage potential is highly uncertain. But we looked at what the literature that we had at that time. It was last year. Was indicating. These were the numbers, and I think that the kind of conclusion that we can draw from this is that there could be enough potential to store an equivalent of decades of annual emissions, or if not a century of CO2 coming from that region. We also looked at the experience with CCS in the region, and we've come to realize that there is a history of academic research, not only at national level, but also the researchers from this region are taking part in international research projects. Private sector also has experience with CCU. EOR has been practiced in Hungary, Romania, and Croatia. And 2 countries, Poland and Romania, almost deployed CCS in the previous decade, but that has unfortunately failed. So the region is not as advanced as Norway, the Netherlands, or the UK, but there is some base to build on for future CCS deployment. So we've established that there's this fertile ground in the form of heavy industries with process emissions. There is some storage potential. There is some existing base and some existing history of CCS engagement in the region. But that is not sufficient if you don't have a good regulatory framework. And that we've realized that varies from country to country in the region, including outright bans on storage or restricted storage in some countries. Maybe an even more or equally important problem is that CCS is very rarely mentioned in the national strategies of these countries, national climate strategies. If it is mentioned, it's usually presented as a transitional solution with high costs and low maturity. Then, throughout the work in this project, we also engaged with the local stakeholders from public institutions, from the industry, and in general, they are quite cautious about CCS. The association they have about CCS is that it's a high-cost technology. They notice lack of government support, lack of funding for CCS projects. It's associated with complex administrative procedures. Issues related with CO2 storage are perceived as a concern, and there's this overall perception that there's a lot of complexity around CCS infrastructure. So many of them actually prefer CCU over CCS. And pretty much everyone was pointing out that there is a need for bigger regional cooperation and also cooperation across different industrial sectors. So we wouldn't be a good CCS project if we didn't look at public opinion, public acceptance. So we reviewed as well what different research studies say about this, and the conclusion is that there is overall lack of knowledge about CCS in the region. Also, the attitudes towards more ambitious climate action tend to be lower than in other countries of the European Union. And we know from the past that there is a history of opposition to CCS projects, as was the case in Poland with the Bełchatów project, or other infrastructural or exploration projects, like the opposition to fracking in Romania, for example. So what I've presented was part of the first phase of the project. So we did all this last year, and we put that in our reports that have been published as well. And this year we've just concluded and published a series of national CCS deployment roadmaps, which include our recommendations for policymakers and industry actors on what we think is needed to deploy CCS. And I've tried to encapsulate this in 7 key recommendations. So our first recommendation is to create national CCS platforms for knowledge sharing, for advocacy, or to increase engagement in European and international CCS platforms, such as Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum or CO2 GeoNet, Zero Emissions Platform, and most recently the CCUS Forum that has just been formed by the European Commission. We definitely think that there could be more contribution from CE stakeholders. Very important to include CCS in national and sectoral strategies, to give CCS a more prominent role as a tool for decarbonization. And of course, there has to be some funding that goes with it to help pilot projects and then further on to help scale them up. There's a need to identify industrial clusters that could then form CCS hubs based on open access, shared transport and storage infrastructure that could span across country borders, also across different industrial sectors. And very importantly, there is a need for an adequate regulatory framework that would remove inconsistencies and that would become, rather than being a roadblock, would become an enabler for CCS projects. And finally, important point about engaging with the local communities and building public support for CCS. So we've seen some very promising announcements lately in the region. 2 very interesting projects from the cement sector. Both have been selected for funding from the Innovation Fund. The UNRAV project in Bulgaria and Go for EcoPlanet in Poland. We can see both are at industrial scale. The Polish project doesn't have details on the volumes, but it could kind of be deduced if you look at the information about the Gdańsk interconnector project, which is also an interesting project that has been selected as a project of common interest, which makes it eligible for EU funding from Connecting Europe facility. These 2 projects, the Polish cement project and the Gdańsk interconnector project, are actually connected in the way that the cement plant will be supplying CO2 for the Gdańsk project, which is essentially an infrastructure project. it's actually great that these projects are aiming at starting operations already this decade. The Bulgarian project in 2028 and the Gdańsk project already in 2025. And then interesting announcement, although maybe still early to kind of bet on it, but there was also a memorandum of understanding between the natural gas transport system operators in Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia on cooperation in hydrogen and CO2 cross-border transport. So this proves that the interest is growing in CCS in the region, on the emitter side, also in companies from the oil and gas or actors from the oil and gas sector. So we are quite optimistic, and we could tell that there is actually momentum is building in the region in CCS. So what's next for the project? After we've published the deployment roadmaps, CCS deployment roadmaps, we will have other events, another series of national seminars and workshops, another event in Brussels next year, a regional conference, and we'll also continue our dialogue with the stakeholders to inspire them with our recommendations and help them build new CCS projects in the region. So we have a website. All the reports that we publish, that we produce, are published on the website. We also have recordings of the past events. We have our accounts on Twitter and LinkedIn, so please follow us on social media, and I hope to give you more good updates another time. So that will be it. Thank you.